Greetings and welcome to the last in our series of 4 panels, Rhodes Responds. My name is Geoff Bakewell and I am a member of the faculty here at Rhodes College. I'm in the Department of Greek and Roman Studies, where I'm a professor, and I have the privilege to hold a chair, the Irene B. and J. Walter McDonnell Chair. I also direct the college's Meeman Center for Lifelong Learning, and it's in that capacity that I'm happy to be here this evening. As I said, this is the 4th and final panel devoted to the COVID-19 pandemic. If you've been with us on previous Wednesday evenings, we've explored topics like the science of COVID-19, the depiction of epidemics in history and literature, and then the societal effects of COVID-19, with particular emphasis on the economy, healthcare, and education, and with a particular eye to the way in which the current pandemic is having the frequent effect of magnifying existing inequities across society. So this evening, our panel is going to focus on coping with COVID-19, and we're pleased to present this to you as one of the ways in which the college is doing what it does best, namely grappling with really profound and intense questions that are multidimensional. And we're doing so drawing on our expertise. We have a remarkable body of faculty and staff trained in all kinds of disciplines. And what we're trying to do tonight is bring together some of that expertise and share it with you in the hope that it may give us all some idea of ways that we can productively cope with COVID-19, both as individuals and as broader communities. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you tonight 3 of my very distinguished colleagues, and you're going to see them appear as I describe them. The first is Dr. Patrick Gray. He's a professor of religious studies and teaches in the college's interdisciplinary humanities program. He received his PhD from Emory University, and previously he taught at both Emory and Oglethorpe University, as well as in Japan. Before that, he did things that really prepared him for Rhodes. He worked at Disney World, drove a delivery truck, and participated in medical and psychological experiments because, as he says, he was young and needed the money. An essential worker. His research focuses on the Greco-Roman context of early Christianity and the history of biblical interpretation. His next book, which I would add is his 10th, will be published next year by Cambridge University Press. And several years ago, in 2013, he was very rightly recognized for all of his expertise with the college's Clarence Day Award for Outstanding Research in Creativity. So Dr. Patrick Gray of Religious Studies. My colleague, Dr. Becky Klatzkin, holds a PhD in behavioral neuroscience from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She came to Rhodes in 2011 and is currently Associate Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience. She studies stress eating in women, specifically how chronic stress impacts the psychological and physiological reasons why some people stress eat and others do not. She teaches classes in both psychology and neuroscience, offering courses such as Introduction to Psych and Clinical Neuroscience. She and her husband are proud parents of a 4-year-old named Emerson and a 2-year-old named Evan, in case they are listening. The Reverend Beatrix Weil is our chaplain, the chaplain of Rhodes College. She holds an undergraduate degree from the University of Notre Dame and an MDiv from Princeton Theological Seminary, where she also received a certificate in theology, women, and gender. She is an ordained Presbyterian minister and has served in a hospital, a high school, religious organizations of various stripes, and 3 colleges. Here at Rhodes, Chaplain Beatrix has become an expert in throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. Translating that into non-technical terms, it means she uses different technologies and programs to encourage connections within our Rhodes community. So these are our panelists. As I say, I'm Geoff Bakewell, and the way we're planning to proceed this evening is to offer each of our experts a window of 5 to 12 minutes or so in which they're going to present an initial statement laying out some of the ways they approach the phenomenon of coping with the various stresses of COVID-19. And then we're going to have more of a free-for-all as we respond to each other. There'll be a question and answer function in which we welcome you to submit your own questions, and we will be taking those and working with them weaving them into our conversation, sometimes addressing them directly. So feel free as you look at your screens down at the bottom, there's a Q&A button. Click on that, send us a question, and we will be happy to address it as we can. So that's the rough format for the evening. And I guess I should say a little bit about why I brought these individuals together. They were all gracious enough to say yes when I asked them. And I think each one of them has something to contribute in productive ways to helping us reframe intellectually and in some senses and in some cases practically what we're all experiencing in various ways and help us think about what this current pandemic is giving us a chance to do, namely reflect, consider out of a variety of disciplines and practices what some of the best ways we can respond to this very, very challenging time. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to our first panelist, Dr. Patrick Gray. Patrick?
Thanks, Geoff. A number of the texts and topics I teach here at Rhodes have been crossing my mind as we've gone through this pandemic of the last few months, along with several other faculty. I teach a course here called The Search for Values in the Light of Western History and Religion, but I want to start in the East, in China, and not because it looks like that's where this outbreak probably began, but because I'm reminded of a story from the early 1970s between Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai and Henry Kissinger, who was Secretary of State under Nixon at the time. They were both students of history, and in the course of a conversation, Kissinger asked Zhou what he thought of the French Revolution, and his response was, well, it's too soon to tell. And I always thought that was funny. It's like a perfect illustration of the stereotype of the longer time horizon that you find among the Chinese, people with a very long history, in contrast to the much younger whippersnapper Americans who've only been around for a few centuries. It's too soon to tell, 1789. It turns out he probably misunderstood the question. The translator maybe flubbed it. He was probably talking about the student protests in Paris in 1968, not 1789, but that ruins a good story. Nonetheless, too soon to tell is a phrase that keeps running through my mind. What should we think about the pandemic? How should we respond to it? Medically, economically, politically, socially, culturally? It's too soon to tell. What should we do to deal with it? How should we cope with it? Have our efforts so far been successful? It's too soon to tell. Could the death figures have been much, much higher had we not shut things down when we did? Maybe. It's too soon to tell. It's possible there might have only been a minor difference in the way the curve went had we kept the economy open, perhaps, but it's too soon to tell. And how are things going to rebound? How's the economy going to rebound after going on pause? Too soon to tell. Why is it too soon to tell? One reason is because we lack good data, timely data, complete data. And this is where my mind turns to some of the texts that I teach, specifically Plato. Plato's teacher Socrates famously said that wisdom is knowing that you know nothing. Maybe it's more accurate to say that he meant wisdom is knowing what you don't know or knowing what the limits of your knowledge is. We all know something. We all know lots of things, but not as much as we think we know, and not nearly as much as we don't know about all sorts of things. And that kind of radical ignorance is hard to accept, but it's inescapable, and it's part of being human. Since the advent of the internet, we're repeatedly told that our problem now is not access to information or knowledge or data, but the ability to process the deluge of information that is at our fingertips and how to put it into the proper context. And I think that's true here, but it's only part of the issue. We really do lack critical information, which is stressful. And lots of the things that we think we know may turn out not to be true. And I don't mean that in a snarky, fake news kind of way. What I mean is that even if the information we have is accurate, if it's incomplete, or if it's selective, or if it's delayed or skewed in some other way, then it throws a real wrench into the process. And this is the frustrating aspect. Perhaps one day we're going to have complete and completely accurate information about the pandemic, but that's going to come too late, too little too late. We need it in real time for it to be of real use now to save lives, save jobs, and so forth. But now is precisely when we don't have it, and we have to act now. There are times where doing nothing is actually better than acting now, because sometimes you can make things worse, but I don't think this is one of those times. I think we had to do something. If only it were as simple as saying, just listen to the experts. If we didn't know it before, we know it now. Experts don't always agree. I'm not saying experts never agree, but most people who have expertise or have some kind of specialization know that things are pretty complicated. Much more complicated than non-experts are aware of. It's only a slight exaggeration to say that much of what experts do is argue with other experts about things non-experts either don't understand or don't really care much about. There's the old saying that if you get two rabbis in a room, you'll get at least three opinions. Or a story about Harry Truman, who said he wanted an economist with one arm because he was tired of asking his economic advisors for advice. And they'd say, well, on the one hand, ... on the other hand, he's like, just give me one answer. And here's where I come back to Plato again. This time I have in mind Plato's Republic, his long, very long work about constructing an ideal city and the need for philosopher kings. Until philosophers become kings, or until the people who we have as kings now learn how to philosophize, there will be no end of trouble. We won't be able to build a just city, is what he said. We didn't already know it. We know it now. We're not governed by philosopher kings, but it's not just us. No other countries are governed by philosopher kings either. And I'm reminded of this as I listen to all the different arguments about what we need to do to meet this particular challenge. And as we realize the many different trade-offs that we have to deal with. Most obviously, there are public health consequences. If we don't social distance, if we don't quarantine, lots more people are going to get very sick and die. Just as obviously, on the economic side of things, if we do close up shop and shut things down and urge people to stay home, people are going to lose jobs, they're going to lose income, and that's serious. Those are real harms. Socially, culturally, if we close schools and churches and synagogues and the like, there are other kinds of harms done to the well-being of communities and to individuals. There are lots of stories about the kind of mental health kind of effects of this kind of isolation. Becky may or may not talk about these sorts of things, but those are real issues as well. On occasion, all the major considerations point in the same direction, but there are always trade-offs, no matter what decision we make, no matter what choice we make. This is true with everything. There are always trade-offs. You do one thing, you're giving up something else. You're sacrificing one thing to gain something else. Opting, in this case, opting to prioritize public health, flattening the curve on the spread of the virus requires one set of policies that will entail major economic sacrifices that will bring great pain. Opting to prioritize the economy would mean keeping more businesses open, which would help people pay their bills, put food on the table, but would almost certainly be bad for public health. So, what do? It's foolish to think there's one and only one obvious solution and that there are no difficult trade-offs to be made. That's not a mature way of looking at things. There are always trade-offs. And this is where I return to the philosopher kings that Plato tells us about. If you want to stop a pandemic, you consult the experts. In this case, epidemiologists like Anthony Fauci, or maybe the head of the CDC. Remembering, of course, that these experts often disagree among themselves, sometimes publicly, and that there are different epidemiological models that envision different scenarios. If you want to know how to maintain a viable economy, you consult experts like Harvard economists, like Larry Summers or someone like that. Remembering, of course, that economists also disagree among themselves and make lots of predictions that turn out to be wrong. Some of my best friends are economists, but that's where I got the joke. Economists have predicted 10 of the last 5 recessions. You know, sometimes they're wrong. So you've got your experts on the economy, on mental health, on public health, on epidemics, but how do you decide whether to prioritize public health or the economy or something else? That question is not a medical or a scientific question. It's not an economic question. It's something that's prior to that. The question, what should we prioritize? Which is more important? You've got to choose one or the other. If you want to err in one direction or other, which one do you choose? That's not an economic or a scientific question. It's a political question. or maybe an ethical question, or a philosophical, or a metaphysical, or even a theological question. Scientists and economists can weigh in on that question, but when they do so, they don't do so as economists and as scientists. It's more as a philosopher. They don't say I'm a philosopher. But we all, if we're an expert in one thing, we sometimes have a hard time realizing we're not experts in other things as well. So when scientists and economists weigh in on a question, on this particular question, what should our priorities be? Their opinion doesn't really have any more validity and shouldn't carry any more weight than a non-economist or a non-scientist. It shouldn't carry any less weight, but not any more. It's a prudential question. What are our priorities? What should they be? And it's a question that requires no small amount of wisdom and discernment. And what you need is an expert. You need an expert whose area of expertise is setting priorities. And we don't really have a name for that. That's not, there's not a job description that fits. It's not obvious who, if anyone's qualified. For Plato, that's where you call in the philosopher kings. They didn't have philosopher kings either, just like we don't. And that's part of why the Republic is regarded as utopian literature. It's great in theory, but hard, maybe impossible to put into practice. And that's kind of where we find ourselves. We have competing demands, and it's hard to rank them. So I have more I could say, but I'll stop there. I'm looking forward to hear what Becky and Beatrix have to say.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Becky, how about you?
Absolutely, thank you. I'm going to share my screen because I prepared some slides. And I'm just really thankful to be able to talk to you all today about using comfort food to cope with stress and the implications to COVID-19. Move my face out of the way here. So I'm going to start by asking two major questions and attempting to answer them as best I can in the time allotted. But I'll be looking forward to really getting your feedback and any questions you all have about anything that I talk about. I'll be excited to hear about that in the chat or Q&A. We'll start with how does stress lead to eating, and how does eating help us cope with stress? And I think it's really important to understand the physiological and psychological mechanisms of these questions, because it might sound obvious that stress leads to eating and weight gain and potentially obesity, but it's important to understand the psychological and physiological motivations underlying our behavior so that we can have more control over these behaviors. And then I'll talk about the relevance of stress eating to the current context. So we'll ask, how do stress, obesity, and race interact to increase risk of infection, particularly viral infection, COVID-19? And then alternative coping strategies. So we'll end on a positive and a helpful note, hopefully. How can we regulate our emotions in more positive ways? Now I'm going to start building a model of trying to explain eating in response to stress, particularly comfort foods. And by comfort foods, I mean foods that are high in sugar and fat, and the foods that just are really rewarding to us. That's different for everybody. And I'm first going to talk about the physiological and psychological reasons why stress would cause comfort food intake. And those are going to be different for everybody. We all have different reasons why we may eat comfort food in response to stress to try to regulate our emotions. But I'm going to name a few. Physiologically, increased cortisol that leads to comfort food intake for most. Sensitivity of our brain reward system to food cues. What that means is when we are under stress, our brain reward system becomes highly activated in response to any food cue, such as like smell or taste or even mention or like an advertisement for food. Our brain activates in our reward system so that we want that reward of food more under stress. Stress also causes sleep deprivation. I know we've all experienced not being able to sleep because of just whatever stressor is going on in our lives. And then during the day, we end up, really not having the cognitive capacity to make smart choices related to eating. So our thought processes are not as strong, and we rely on our more innate, reward brain areas to make decisions. And then, finally, I just talk about stress creating the need to regulate emotions. Stress brings up lots of negative things, feelings, depression, sadness, fear, anger. And so we don't really want to deal with that sometimes. And so we want to use food to try to regulate those emotions. And then the question becomes, does it actually work? Does using comfort food to deal with our stress actually help? And you know, me saying, yeah, it tastes good, it makes me feel better. But that actually is a really short-term response. In the long term, it actually doesn't help us regulate our emotions or decrease our stress. But in the short term, we do often see decreased stress. That's physiologically with cortisol decreasing, and it's psychologically with us feeling better, feeling less stressed. We also find that our brain reward system is even more activated after we eat. Comfort food increases our dopamine in our brain, which is our feel-good reward chemical in our brain. And that's the same chemical that's released when we have sex, when we eat comfort food, when we take drugs, when we, you know, hug a friend we haven't seen in a long time. So this is a really powerful system. And so we learn that when we're stressed, when we eat comfort food, we feel better. And this is emotional relief. And that emotional relief serves as self-medication. And this is not always a conscious process, but we're learning this cycle. And it's more of an operant conditioning scenario where we're getting rewarded for behavior, and that behavior is probably going to continue. And so, as I said before, it's pretty short-lived, this emotional relief, because when we stop eating, we stop feeling better, really, and the stress increases because we never really dealt with it to begin with. And once we increase our self-awareness, once we stop eating, the stress returns, and this cycle basically perpetuates itself. And so it's just a strong, both Pavlovian learning and operant learning, where we're not really as much in control of our behaviors as we would like. We're more at the mercy of these learning or behaviorist learning strategies. This is all any of my former students out there remembering their interests like stuff now. And so this all leads to weight gain and potentially obesity. And now I'll move on to the part where I want to talk about why this potential weight gain and obesity from the stress eating cycle is particularly relevant in the current context. So as I said, stress leads to comfort food eating and potentially obesity, and obesity-related chronic conditions such as diabetes, cardiovascular disease, sleep apnea. And these conditions, as well as obesity, really lead to our immune systems being compromised. And thus, people with obesity have a chronic low-grade inflammation, which makes people with obesity more vulnerable to infection, particularly COVID-19. So what we're seeing now is that people with obesity are suffering disproportionately. So they're getting COVID-19 at higher rates, and they're also having a more severe course of the illness. So what I want to do is add one more piece to this puzzle, and that is talking about race and how race really fits into this model. And so what I have here is an NPR story that says who's hit hardest by COVID-19, why obesity, stress, and race matter. And a lot of news outlets covered this. But, you know, when I was asked to do this, this panel, it was all COVID-19 all the time in the news. But recently, you know, with the recent urgency and validity of the Black Lives Matter movement, due to the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and just so many others, we see this real need to talk about this. And so now we see that in the news, it's COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matter movement, and they both are related here. And so, you know, we see these stories, and so these news stories such as this. So I really want to add, to use this model to explain why, you know, race matters here and why people of color are disproportionately affected by COVID-19. And you guys may have, I hope you did see my colleague Kendra Hotz's presentation last week in this webinar. She beautifully explained this, and so I'm gonna piggyback off of her. But I highly recommend you catching her talk if you haven't seen it, because she explained most of this. But what I'm going to talk about is just how our model is already, you know, is just ripe to include race as part of this. So Kendra Rhodes explained that systemic racism is deeply rooted in Memphis, and this creates chronic stress. And specifically for Black Memphians who are disproportionately affected by COVID-19. Now, more broadly, people of color all across the country are affected by chronic stress due to overt racism, not as overt, subtle racism, as well as institutional racism. So inequities are just really built into our system. And so chronic stress is a real issue. And just looking at the model here, you can see that creates potentially more stress eating, obesity-related conditions, compromised immune system, and more vulnerability to infection. And this is one reason. Obesity is just one route by which, or to explain why people of color suffer more from this illness. And so again, please read these stories and look at Kendra's talk last week for more details on this. So this discussion isn't meant to cause like fear or discomfort. It's really to try to bring more awareness to these issues, and because knowledge is power, and the more we understand about this, the more we can take positive actions. And so we lose a lot of power and we lose a lot of control in situations of chronic stress, such as a pandemic, such as systemic racism. And so how can we kind of take back that control? And that's what I'm going to end with before we take questions. And I'm excited to hear what Beatrix has to say.
Okay, and I'm going to jump in for just a minute before Beatrix says something, and I'm just going to point out for our audience that the previous sessions to which Becky referred are available online. You can find them on YouTube. They're also on our webpage with the Rhodes Respond webpage. There are links to them there. So please go out and search those down and visit the previous sessions as well. Sorry, Beatrix?
Oh, actually, sorry, do you mind really quickly?
No, go ahead.
I really want to hear from, I know that I'm already going really long, but I just wanted to say really quickly, if anyone wants to ask me more about these things later, we can, but really quickly, just two more ways we can more like actively take control over what we kind of are losing control in a chronic stress situation I want to talk about these last two, which are active coping and challenge mindset. So just really doing anything which is active coping in response to stress decreases stress. And that could be exercise, meditation, sleep, seeking out social support, or anything else that you're trying to actively cope with the issue. And same with a challenge mindset. So all this is a challenge mindset is when we have a stress or like losing a job or something like that. We can frame it in our mind as a threat, which we don't have the resources to cover it, to be able to do anything about it. Or we can frame it as a challenge. And so that challenge means that we can actually have the resources to do it. And that's just based on how we think about it. And so if we think about stress as a challenge, then we're going to have less stress during it. We're going to accomplish whatever task we have better, and we're going to be resilient to stress more in the future. So I'll leave with that strategy. And also I just wanted to show some Memphis area and national counseling resources in case anyone feels like reaching out for support during this time. All right, thank you. I'm going to stop sharing.
Good. Thank you, Becky. Beatrix?
Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here with you. So my name is Beatrix Weil. I am an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church USA. And as the chaplain of Rhodes College, I have the best job in the world. Rhodes' Presbyterian heritage positions us to have an open and welcoming posture when it comes to the vast and varied traditions that our students, faculty, and staff bring to our context. So in the spirit of the Presbyterian belief that God meets us exactly where we are, I decided to choose my text for today, not from the Bible, but from the realm of science fiction, which many of my students hold as sacred. My text this evening comes from the movie The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and I will play a clip from the opening scene.
Thanks for all the fish. So sad that it should come to this. We try to warn you all, but oh dear. You may outshare our intellect, which might explain your disrespect for all the natural wonders that grow around you. So long in thanks for all the fish. his next to the feet. We thought that most of you was neat, especially tiny tots real
Hope you enjoyed that. And let's see. Okay, now do we see my PowerPoint? Yes. Thank you, Geoff. I see you nodding. In the world of Douglas Adams's The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, humans are revealed to be neither the first most intelligent creatures on Earth, nor the second most intelligent. The second most intelligent creatures were, of course, dolphins, who curiously enough had long known of the impending destruction of the planet Earth. That's one of the lines from the movie. In the opening scene of the movie, the dolphins sing their last ever message to humankind, fully knowing that the world is going to explode in just a few days. Perhaps we can learn something about coping with COVID-19 and feeling like maybe our world is, going to hell in a handbasket. Something we can learn from the wisdom of these fictional dolphins facing impending doom. These are the lyrics. So thanks and thanks, so long and thanks for all the fish, so sad that it should come to this. We tried to warn you, but oh dear, you may not share our intellect, which might explain your disrespect for all the natural wonders that grow around you. So long, and thanks for all the fish. The world's about to be destroyed. There's no point in getting all annoyed. Lie back and let the planet dissolve. Despite those nets of tuna fleets, we thought that most of you were sweet, especially tiny tots and your pregnant women. So long, and thanks for all the fish. The 4 strategies that stick out to me when it comes to coping with COVID-19 are gratitude, creativity, rest, and reframing. My hope in choosing a pop culture reference as my text for today is that the lyrics or the melody or the images of dolphins, when you see them or hear them in the coming weeks, will help you to remember these 4 coping mechanisms so that you can use them yourself going forward. Let us learn from the wisdom of science fiction and dolphins. The refrain of this song is "So long and thanks for all the fish," which is repeated again and again. The dolphins are rooted in gratitude, even as their planet is about to be destroyed. And similarly, a gratitude practice can change our mindsets and keep us grounded when it perhaps feels like there is impending doom to our world as well. So rather than focusing on all the fish the dolphins did not get a chance to consume before the destruction of planet Earth, they relish the experiences that they have had and all the fish that they did have the pleasure of consuming. And for you and I, a gratitude practice might look like something when we first wake up in the morning or right before we go to bed at night, as simple as recalling 2 or 3 things for which you are grateful. And gratitude practices can reduce stress and increase empathy for others, and even empathy for yourself, which is going to be something that gets you through this. And as you work that muscle in your mind, you actually start to notice things that you're grateful for, then more so than before you practiced gratitude, like consciously. Because when you're looking for things to be grateful for, you will find them. They'll start appearing. You'll start to unconsciously see them more and more. So journaling and a spiritual practice such as the Examine prayer are great places to start with a gratitude practice. The second strategy that I've observed in myself, my peers, and my students is practicing creativity. The dolphins croon, "You may not share our intellect, which might explain your disrespect for the natural wonders that grow around you." The wisdom of these dolphins is to respect the natural world. I think that certainly attests to their previous point about gratitude, and it also gestures toward something greater. One embodiment of appreciation for the natural wonders of creation is to, in fact, join creation and become creators ourselves. To join in the work of God and nature by creating art, music, poetry, even doodles on a note page count. Gardening is even creativity, and I think that anything that gets you outdoors and appreciating and respecting the natural wonders that grow around you will also provide some resilience against the negative emotions that come with being in a pandemic. The benefits of art therapy are documented, but what I hear people tell me is that creating gives them a sense of satisfaction and accomplishment. I hear people say that it feels good to use a side of their brain that they do not normally get to use. And I do not hear people explicitly say this, but I think that something that's also happening is that somewhere in their guts, people know that it is subversive to create in the midst of a pandemic that brings death. To say, I know that death is around me and I will create anyway. I will respect and co-create with the natural wonders that grow all around me. So an important thing to keep in mind is that creativity is not canceled in this time of pandemic. The dolphins continue, the world's about to be destroyed. There's no point getting all annoyed. Lie back and let the planet dissolve. Now, full disclosure, Rhodes College graduates, many a doctor and researcher. If you are in a hospital or on one of the teams working on finding a vaccine for coronavirus, please do not lie back and let the planet dissolve. Please continue researching for a vaccine. But there is wisdom in taking rests. For both commoners like me who are doing absolutely nothing to create a COVID-19 vaccine, and also for you who work in hospitals and in labs. Rest fuels the rest. Rest is a very important part of getting the rest done. It is appropriate to put down your work and avoid reading the news every once in a while, especially when your body is crying out and begging for you to slow down. Many folks are working from home nowadays, which means that the boundaries between personal and professional life are kind of blurred. It can be really easy to lose track of time and work from dawn until dusk without resting. And I think that that's, see that in my students a lot, that they don't rest. But one coping strategy for dealing with COVID-19 is to create boundaries that promote rest in your life. The final point I'd like to make about coping during COVID-19 is the use of reframing and adjusting expectations from the dolphins. Despite those nets of tuna fleets, we thought that most of you were sweet, especially tiny tots and your pregnant women. The dolphins' initial appraisal of humanity is negative, referencing the practice of tuna fishers accidentally or otherwise killing dolphins while fishing for tuna. But then they reassess and tell a different story that gives them strength to go forward, that the toddlers and pregnant women they interacted with were at least delightful, and the dolphins conclude that humans on the whole were sweet. So these are helpful reframing stories, and these are the stories that the dolphins tell themselves. And we can use stories too to reframe and readjust our experience of the pandemic. So for example, you are probably competent, and you are probably used to doing an incredible amount of work, and you're probably used to doing that incredible amount of work really well. But it is not reasonable to expect yourself to do as much work as you did pre-pandemic, or the same, for your work to be as good with the same amount of time resources. We are in an entirely different ballgame. If you are still holding yourself to your pre-pandemic standards, let it go. Give yourself permission to let some things go. Reframe your work. So either I was able to do XYZ, but now that conditions have changed, what I'm capable of doing has changed too. That's one example of a reframing. And give yourself permission. And another storytelling tool that you can use is making plans for different scenarios that arise. During the pandemic, you might feel stress or anxiety or anger or grief, and you can make a plan for that. You can literally write down in a journal or type it in your notes on your phone and then delete it before anyone else can see it. When I feel blank, I can blank. So for example, when I feel overwhelmed, I can use my deep breathing practices. When I feel sad, I can turn to my gratitude practice. And this can also be useful for making plans. So you don't have to like repeat them in your head and stress and go down to an anxiety spiral about them. So for example, I will keep myself safe from coronavirus by wearing a mask outdoors. If my cousin gets coronavirus, I will drive to Louisiana to take care of him. Create the stories that will give you strength and resiliency. In conclusion, I hope that the next time you see a dolphin, you will remember these 4 coping strategies. Thanks for all the fish. gratitude, respect the natural wonders that grow around you, or even create your own. There's no point to getting all annoyed, lie back and let the planet dissolve. Take time to rest. And despite those nets of tuna fleets, we thought that most of you were sweet. Reframe your stories to build resiliency. And if all else fails, I do recommend enjoying something lighthearted, like a movie. Thank you so much. Geoff, I'll pass it back to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Beatrix. Okay, so just a brief reminder to our audience, we are happy to take your questions through the Q&A button down at the bottom, and feel free to submit those at any point during the conversation. I'm going to go ahead and turn back to our panelists for a moment and ask them to sort of reflect individually or jointly on a question. A couple of common themes that seem to me to arise from what you all were talking about were questions of ignorance and knowledge. You heard Patrick talk about the current situation as one characterized by radical ignorance about really important things. You heard Becky talk about knowledge is power, and you heard Beatrix talk about a recognition in some senses of our place in the world and the good things that come with that, right? So all of those relate to a kind of knowledge. I guess the thing I would like to ask you all to sort of think about for a minute and tell us your thoughts is, I think all of you suggest in some ways that even though we are surrounded by so many unknowns related to COVID-19, right? How transmissible is it? How do we get it? What are the mysteries of who is affected more radically, who is affected mildly or even asymptomatically, right? All these kinds of questions. Is it safe for me to do X? Is it safe for my family to do Y this summer? We're all having to become amateur experts at risk assessment. We don't know a lot of these external things, but I think that one of the things that we do have the opportunity to do, and this is true whether we think about Plato or whether we think about stress eating or whether we think about the kinds of practices that Beatrix mentioned, is that we still have the capacity for a kind of increased self-knowledge. We may not know much about COVID-19, even though our knowledge is increasing by leaps and bounds, but we still have many tools to come to know ourselves. And in that kind of self-knowledge is a sort of power, I think. And moreover, as Patrick will know and others will know, the question in Plato of self-knowledge is also linked to that bigger question of justice. That is to say, who I am is related to what my community needs from me and what I should do for my community. And so there's two kinds of questions. Who am I and what is my place in the community come together? And I think I was just going to ask each of you to think about that and give us your responses or thoughts.
So, Geoff, you alluded to the inscription over the oracle at Delphi, "Know thyself." That's the path of wisdom, right? And as you're asking that question, I was thinking back to part of Becky's presentation, where Becky, you were going through that cycle of stress and eating and the high and the low. To what extent is knowledge power? I mean, it's of course helpful to know that, and then there's operationalizing it or whatever. How is there a secret to putting that knowledge into action, or is there just this kind of je ne sais quoi, this sort of where do you find the willpower to do it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I stress eat and I study it. I mean, there's just no, we all do it at times, right? And so, right, to and on one side, knowledge is power, but on the other side, how do we actually, I think part of what Beatrix was talking about is, all of it was very important, but to what you're talking about is, if we can rest, if we can take care of ourselves, we're more likely to be able to do that, have the power to use that knowledge and also have the power to help our community. So we take care of ourselves in certain ways and we know more about ourselves, and we can have a little bit more control and a little bit more power. Not to say that we don't have stress, not to say that we never use comfort food or, you know, to relieve it, but that we can at least take better care of ourselves so we can take better care of others.
I think I'll add, I think it's worth learning to listen to your body and acknowledge your emotions without judging them. Like if fear keeps coming up for you and you keep pushing it down, like, I'm afraid of, that's just gonna make everything else more difficult. That's gonna make sitting in meetings more difficult. That's gonna make making decisions more difficult. So I think there's value in just sitting with yourself and getting to know yourself. And like if you feel, let's, you know, fear as an example, just sit with it and don't judge it as it's bad, I'm feeling fear. But I guess this is a little reframing, but what does this fear tell me about my values? Like, well, this fear tells me that my family is very important to me. That's why I'm feeling afraid for my family's health. So I think that that's worth, and then that will help you narrow down like all the advice there is out there and pick like, these are the 3 things I'm going to focus on for decreasing my risk or decreasing my risk of transferring it. But I think that knowing thyself can help you like narrow down the noise and get to what's going to be important and most effective for a coping strategy for you.
Beatrix, another thing that you said reminded me of this question of self-knowledge. You mentioned as one of the coping mechanisms, a prayer of gratitude, I think you were talking about. And it reminded me of another prayer, a very famous prayer, often called the Serenity Prayer. Lord, grant me the serenity to accept the things I can't change, the courage to change the things I can change, the wisdom to know the difference. I think it originates with Reinhold Niebuhr, an American theologian. But I was thinking about that, but also thinking about the way it's used in Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse 5. And that novel, he talks about the main character, Billy Pilgrim, having that prayer framed and put over his desk or something like that. Maybe he's a therapist, I can't remember. But in the novel, Vonnegut says, here's what it said: God grant me the serenity to accept things I cannot change, courage to change things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And then the next line was, among the things that Billy Pilgrim could not change were the past, the present, and the future. So it's kind of like, everything is outside my control, which maybe that's accurate, maybe that's not accurate, but I can see how that sense of uncertainty and lack of control would increase stress. We feel it even more, I think, now over the last century or so, as we've been able, through science, all these kind of different advances in science, we've been able to exert much, much, much more control than any other time in human history over our surroundings. And so as a species, we've come a long way, which counterintuitively, I guess, means that when we are reminded that we don't have control, it's all the more shocking and all the more troubling when that kind of hits home.
The control thing for me, something that I find rising in myself a lot is that I cannot control what my neighbor does. Sorry, not my actual neighbor if she's watching. But like if the person I'm what do I do? I don't do a lot outside of the house, truth be told. But if I'm walking outside and my neighbor doesn't wear their mask, like their decisions affect me. And I know that all I can do is control, I can only control my decisions and my responses and reactions to what other people do. But this has definitely brought up the strange and delicate relationship between control and how our actions like affect our neighbor or affect the community in a broader way.
Yeah, thank you. One of the things I've heard that, and that self-knowledge and that dimension of knowing ourselves and in some senses seeing our relation to other people is a crucial part, I think, of coping with things now. One of the more helpful questions I've heard throughout this, or raised once throughout this last set of months, is the question of not only who are we, but who do we want to be after this is over? What kind of people do we want to be after this is over? And that question is sometimes framed with self-improvement projects that I've heard people mention, but also framed in terms of who do we want to be with regard to our neighbors? What are our responsibilities? What sorts of things has the pandemic laid bare? What about our own sins has it laid bare? What about our own societal inequities? What about our relationship to one another is, in some sense, if we were to like shift registers for a moment and speak in terms of prophetic scripture, right? What is the current moment revealing about us and our society, and what do we want to do differently, God willing, once we get through this, even as we are in the midst of it?
One response might be, I'm looking at one of the questions that are in the Q&A, which intersects with the question you just asked. Someone asked, these thoughts remind us that we are physical and emotional and spiritual beings, and by paying attention to these aspects of ourselves each day, we may be better able to cope with COVID. Geoff, you asked, what is this revealing, about ourselves? And we knew that we were spiritual and physical beings before, but you feel it in a way that you didn't previously. When you are kept, here we are Zooming with each other. I taught the second half of the semester like this, sitting in this chair right here, interacting with my students. And yet I wasn't interacting with my students in the same way. I mean, the same words perhaps were being said, but you're reminded that we are physical beings. And that, teaching a class like this or going to a worship service like this rather than being in the same room, there's got to be something, Becky. There's got to be something physiological about that. I can't explain it, but we feel it, that it's not the same. And that's, I keep raising the problems that I think Beatrix and Becky maybe can solve. But, the problem is that the solution is human, some kind of human contact, not like necessarily physical contact where we're hugging each other, though, that functions like comfort food as well, like Becky was saying. But some of the things that we need to deal with it are precisely the things that we can't do right now. That Zoom is better than nothing, but it's just to state the obvious, it's a poor substitute for some of the things we really need.
Yeah, and I was going to add, you brought up control, or I think a lot of us had brought up control earlier. And there's a question in the Q&A about that as well. It asks, can you elaborate on the neurological mechanisms of the challenge mindset, which is about taking more control over the stress, and that's been shown to have better outcomes. And so it asks, the question says, what is it about reframing that allows for this resilience? And I think that's what we've kind of been talking about, is that if we don't have control over what our neighbor does, if we don't have control over this pandemic, maybe we can take some control back by reframing these stressors, particularly having this challenge mindset. So in terms of the neurological mechanisms, which is what the question is asking, just so when they do these studies and they have one group randomly assigned to, both two groups have the exact same task to do, whether it's like putting a golf ball into a hole or like completing a math task, whatever it is. One group is randomly assigned to have a challenge mindset. By saying you have the resources to do this, you can do, you are able to do it. And another is told that you actually don't have the resources to do it, even though both are equally capable. The challenge mindset group not only completes the task better, but has less of a stress response during it, and is more resilient to stressors afterwards. And cognitively, so if I think about what's going on as a threat, my blood vessels are going to constrict. I'm ready to actually be like physically harmed and not bleed out. Like that's what's actually happening when I think of it as a threat. And whereas if I think of it as a challenge, my blood is flowing because I need to be able to think clearly. I need to be able to, in a challenge situation, I need to be able to deal with it. And so physiologically, our bodies change. Cognitively, we are able to pay more attention. Our prefrontal cortices are more activated when we just think of it as a challenge. So there's all these different neurological mechanisms that a challenge mindset, or just like taking control more of the situation, are able to change. So it's pretty remarkable. So there are things I mean, a challenge mindset isn't going to just remarkably get rid of all stress in your life. I mean, there are real stressors out there clearly, but it's been shown to help reduce stress. And actually, I'm going to put a study on that in the chat, maybe. We'll see. I'll find it.
Mm-hmm. Good. Patrick, are you leaning in for a comment?
I'm looking at the different Q&As and seeing if I can answer any questions. Not yet, no.
Okay. Okay.
So, these issues intersect in all kinds of ways. And since I don't have anything really wise to offer, I'm just going to quote other people who do, because something Beatrix or Becky says reminds me of that. And I'm thinking now of Pascal, the 17th century mathematician and theologian. One of my favorite quotations is from him, and it seems to apply in this situation. It said in French, but in English, all of humanity's problems stem from our inability to sit quietly in a room alone. Now, it's maybe an exaggeration, but he says, what we fear is silence and boredom and having to think about some of the things we've been talking about, especially our mortality, for example. Not that, very few of us are going to die from this. Too many people are dying from it, but really a very small percentage of us are going to die from this. But enough of them are dying, enough people are dying that we can't ignore it, and that we're reminded that we're all terminal cases. We're all going to die, and most of us don't want to be reminded of that, and so we seek endless distraction, is Pascal's point, I think, especially from things that bother us, like these kind of existential questions. Over the last few months, some of us have had lots and lots of time alone in a room by ourselves, which is maddening to some of us. Others, it's been a lot more cooped up. I had in late January, we had a fire at our house. Fortunately, it did not destroy the house, but we had to move out for 3 or 4 months. So we were in a smaller apartment, and then halfway through, my daughter had to come home from college, so we were even more crowded in a much smaller space than we used to be. So there was, I wanted to be alone in the room by myself, but it was hard to do. And then you couldn't really go out anywhere. So those kinds of circumstances create a different kind of mental health stress, I guess. Again, I'm just multiplying the problems, hoping that Beatrix or Becky will be able to solve them. But I don't know if others have experienced the same sort of thing. But I keep being, reminded of how a lot of these texts that we've read, a lot of these kind of great books have been where we've been before, if not exactly on the same road, but in the same neighborhood.
Yeah, Patrick, I think you're definitely picking up on something that I experience and I hear other people experiencing. What comes to mind is a Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote on being alone and being together, and how I think what he was saying was, if you cannot be alone with yourself, you need to work that out before you're with other people. And if you can't be with other people, you need to work on being alone with yourself. The two go hand in hand. That our thriving as an interrelated community, civic community, relies both on being able to relate and play well with others, and also be kind and gentle to ourselves. Someone asked strategies to better know thyself that work for you all. I'll say, not the easy answer, but meditation has been really helpful for me. So just sitting and noticing my breath. There are lots of different practices you can do. I think I mentioned the examine prayer, which was very helpful to me. And if you're not religious, you can still do a version of the examine prayer, but it's where you go throughout your whole day. You start with a moment of gratitude, and then you go throughout your whole day and you kind of think about every event that happened during the day, every interaction, and you take note of, did I feel invited and like drawn in to wholeness and authenticity? Or did I feel, so we call that a consolation, or did I feel pushed away? Did I feel like I had to lie? Did I feel like I had to hide? Did I feel like I couldn't be authentic with myself? And that's called desolation. And then you do that practice, go throughout your day, and then you just like cherish one experience that you had throughout the day. So I do that practice during the Christian season of Lent, which we had in basically the month of March this year for 40 days. And it's a really lovely practice, and it's good to do it with a recording. If you cannot find a secular one, then you might have to record yourself and then just listen to yourself doing it. But the examine prayer, if you want to Google search more, that's been one practice that has helped me just notice patterns in my life, and I guess know myself was the language used in the question. Yeah.
And one of the things we've seen repeatedly in the questions is people, and you'll see the link in this, but both things like the Ignatian spiritual exercises, which have a bearing on the things that you're talking about, Beatrix, and Patrick in the Greek philosophical tradition, right? The philosopher who communes with the forms, still goes back down into the cave to help people who have not had the experience that she has in terms of comprehending the forms, right? In Ignatian spirituality, the intense period of self-examination and reflection leads to women and men for others, right? So these traditions of self-knowledge are intimately linked to what imperatives do those create for me to go out and interact with other people, and how and in what ways. So isolation is not, for Plato, contemplation might have been a goal in itself. For Aristotle, it's this contemplation and activity. But so there's that piece of it. And I guess one of the questions we've also had is, what about those instances when we seem to recognize our obligations to others, but other people seem less ready to recognize those obligations, right? What happens if you have a sense of what you should be doing for your community or communities, and other people don't share those same set of feelings?
Great question.
Trying to figure out what the question was. I mean, so the session's called Coping with COVID. I have to confess that I've been in kind of a dark place, and what I mean is I've been on Facebook more than I normally have. That's, I guess, one way I've coped. I never post anything. I just lurk, and like I said, it's a very dark place. That I think that's maybe one way people try to remind others of what they think the common good is, or what they ought to be doing. And there's a lot of good stuff there, but there's a lot of everybody's a pundit now. They have all this time, spare time on their hands, and they're happy to share it with other people. And like I said, it's not all worthless. Trying to think of the right word, but that's it is hard to know where to draw the line between sharing your knowledge, your desire to help to contribute to the common good, and a sense of humility. It's hard to know where to draw that line. Some people have so it's a hard question, whatever the question was, Geoff.
Yeah, do you mean philosophically, what do we do when there are differences, or practically, what do we do when, I believe the question was, when it interferes with my coping, when others do not feel obligated to wear a mask? Just say that that interferes with my coping as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think something that is helpful for me is, I'm only naming it not because I'm good at it, because I'm bad at it. Every single time I've, gotten upset with someone else and then learned a little bit more about their context, I'm always ashamed of when I was mean to people after learning more about their context. And that happens often. So for example, some people cannot wear masks. Like if you have certain medical conditions, like it's going to be very harmful for you to wear a mask. So just a practice of creating stories in your head, like that person is trying the hardest. That person is trying their best and trying their hardest, and today might not be their best day. Sometimes my trying my best is not that great either. Or maybe even they cannot wear their mask, or, wipe down, whatever the situation is. So trying to practice empathy for those around us, which, again, I don't say because I'm any good at it. I say because it's something I think about a lot because I'm pretty bad at it. But we'll have some firsthand knowledge of that come fall when we're back on campus, of the importance of how seriously does our neighbor take precautions.
Yeah, it's very, very frustrating when you want to do something. You want to help fix things, and for many people, it's very frustrating. It is for me, very frustrating to be told, the best you can do is stay at home or put on a mask. And I mean, those things, are important, but it's very stifling for people who, I mean, some people, maybe are not eager to contribute to the public good in that way. But like I said, often when, if you're not a doctor or a nurse, it's frustrating to be told just, kind of sit tight and just wait it out. That's maddening for a lot of people for understandable reasons.
Yeah, my hope is that at Rhodes, we really do seem to attract students who care about society, good citizens. So my hope is that desire for the collective good will give us some protective measures and some hoping for the future.
And the kind of thing, Beatrix, that you're talking about, that kind of creating narratives about other people's lives and experiences that make sense of what they're doing, right, is not unrelated to what we do in the classroom a lot of the time. In courses involving the text Patrick is talking about when we read, one of the things I try to often do with my students is emphasize the need for what I call charitable reading. That is to say, you might not like a text that you're reading, you might not like its conclusions or many things about it, but trying to understand the viewpoint of the person or the people or the culture that created that text, and to engage it on its terms rather than your terms, is a practice that is always challenging, but like most things that way, is also more rewarding than simply interrogating it on one's own terms.
Yeah, I was going to say a similar, the question wasn't exactly, the question was about when other people don't wear a mask, that interferes with my coping. But, another way to think about that is, at least from like the stress literature, what we see is that when we have a stress, like someone's not wearing a mask and I'm like, I'm just, I'm very frustrated and I can't cope and it's raising my stress, and, or whatever other situation, you might be in, losing a job or whatever it is. Or having like homeschool kids or whatever it is in this pandemic, when these stressors come up, the research shows that and this is related to what you were saying, Beatrix, is you were talking about gratitude. These studies say that if I just reframe it to say, look, I'm frustrated and stressed about this because I value my health, because I value my kids' education, because if you really reframe it to say like, I'm feeling this way because I value these things or these people, or my health, then that really reduces stress and it allows for better coping.
Yeah, and that's an empathy practice too, both inward facing and outward facing. I'm not going to get it right, but Brene Brown just said something like, shame in a petri dish will like fester and grow, but add a little bit of empathy, and empathy destroys shame. So I think that a little bit of empathy and gratitude goes a long way, both directed inward to I am doing things because I value them, or these are the things I can control, and also facing outward, which is that person has their own set of values, and they are probably trying their best.
Mm-hmm. One of the other questions we had might go in a slightly different direction. That is to say, one of our listeners asked about do we need to be careful to draw a distinction between optimism and naivete? That is there a value that comes from not coping in some senses, but from rather staring at things head on with as few illusions as we possibly can, and facing the reality of the world, or as the way Lucretius might say, the knowledge that we are all mortal, that in his terms, our souls are mortal, and that's just the way things are, right? De rerum natura, right? And is there a comfort that comes from sort of thinking about numbers in as hard-headed a way as we can?
That's a great question. I mean, it's really like, how much do we allow ourselves to escape?
Mm-hmm.
Or how much because we're all talking about, we escape in different ways. I talked about stress eating, but there are many ways in which we do it. And can we really not escape and sit alone with ourselves and really listen to what's going on? And that's very difficult. And I don't know, that's a great question. Like, are there some nights where, for my specific context, that you should just let yourself have a pint of ice cream or whatever it is and just, feel better. And where's the line, or allow yourself to just like lurk on Facebook for 5 hours, or whatever it is. Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have an answer for that. I don't know if anyone does, but I think it's getting at some of the things we've been bringing up.
I'll add that. So I'm often in situations where I'm the keeper of people's stories, and sometimes the stories are really dark, and I see no value in trying to create meaning out of the meaningless, or trying to say that something was part of a greater plan when I have no authority to say that. So I don't think, and if somebody, like if somebody's experienced grief recently related to COVID, or a death recently related to COVID, and they see the world falling apart around them, and they still have to get up and go to work and put themselves in danger every day so that they don't starve, or so they don't get evicted from not being able to pay rent. Like, I'm never going to tell that person, like, you just need to be more optimistic, or like, where's your hope? Like, I don't think we need to force hope on anyone. Yeah. So I don't think there's value in forcing hope on anyone, or like forcing a single line on anyone. It's been helpful to me, but I'm sure if I thought hard enough, there would be times when that would not have been the route I took as an individual, or for my own, grief or situations.
It's a great question about the difference between optimism and naivete. I think it's right that reframing things can really help. There's a limit to how much you can reframe. When someone's dying, that's a hard fact, right? Though, and I've never thought of it, I've never used the terminology of reframing, but it does make me think of one way of coping with these kind of situations. The Middle Ages, there was a tradition called the ars, or artes moriendi. That's Latin for the art of dying. Today, kind of the ideal is a quick death. you don't want to have to think about it a lot. What's the ideal death? Going in your sleep, right? You don't feel it. You don't like see, but the thinking there, and I don't know that everybody thought this way, but in the Ars Moriendi tradition, the idea was that it was actually a positive good to be able to have the time to see death coming, to be able to prepare for it, to be able to tell the truth about who we are, and to become a kind of a fuller, more mature human being. This goes way back to the ancient Greeks as well, that, the philosophy was often thought of as the practice of learning how to die well. And the way to die well is to live well. It's much easier to say that than to do it, of course. And in our situation, I mean, I think the tradition of Ars Moriendi can be very helpful. But also, I think most of us are not going to die from it. So, if you really are about to die, then it becomes, it really concentrates the mind, and that's something, something to focus the mind. But most of us are not going to die from this. We're going to die from something else. So we can start thinking about that way. But that's, I don't know if we want to think of the Ars Moriendi tradition as a reframing narrative, but it is to some extent, I guess. But most of us won't have the worst case scenario, at least in the near term. Longer, that's where we're all going, though.
And that relates to, I guess, what I'll take as one final question from one of our audience members, namely, how much risk should we as individuals take on or be expected to take on as we work on behalf of our broader communities, as we try to engage in solutions? So there I could see your answer about dying well is living well sort of coming into play there, right? So to what extent do our responsibilities to others, either as healthcare workers or as protesters or in other capacities, to what extent are we asked to or expected to, or should we ask ourselves to take on various kinds of risks for the purpose of living well, both ourselves and as larger groupings?
Last week, and Marshall Graham in his presentation kept talking about how he was betting. He's a gambler, and all joking aside, everything is a calculated risk. I mean, sometimes the stakes are much higher than in other times, but yeah, we're always having to kind of calculate the risk in whatever we do. Now, this one's more complicated because I'm not just calculating the risk for myself, but what I do, of course, touches other people as well. I saw, if I'm not mistaken, I saw that question. Now it's off of the board, but was that question posed by the chairman of the board?
Yes.
Okay, so institutionally we think about risk in certain ways as well too, and I think every college is watching what every other college is doing as well, because we don't want to be the one out there hanging, twisting in the wind in a risky situation.
Good.
I think this all goes back to what we were saying. Beatrix was saying, maybe this is a great way to end. If we're ending, but that Rhodes is a really tight-knit community, and we're going to go back because we want to engage with our students, and the students are going to come back because we want to, come back to this community, which is so important for our mental health and for our, our minds as well. But we're going to do all that we can to keep ourselves safe and our community safe. And so hopefully that's a message that we all strongly have when we come back.
Yes, absolutely. So Beatrix, Patrick, any closing thoughts?
I would invite anyone who is watching, especially any high school or prospective college students, to consider coming to Rhodes. You'll get to discuss these kinds of questions. You'll get to read books and make comparisons and draw parallels, and then also criticize your friends and classmates for the bad parallels they're drawing. I mean, I've seen, everybody's seen all kinds of different examples out there on Facebook and other places. With, again, all this time on people's hands, they've been going back and reading old books and making comparisons. Again, some of them are over the top and kind of ridiculous, and some are more nuanced and very insightful. And so that's a lot of what we do here at Rhodes. So I'll just take the moment to take the opportunity to run that commercial here for anybody who might be watching. And then you can go to other professors and staff like Beatrix and Becky and figure out how to solve some of the problems that have been around for a long time. They have a lot more practical advice to share sometimes.
One more question we had was how to access some of the resources that were shown, especially in the PowerPoints by you, Becky, and you, Beatrix. And so, as I said, these videos will be available online with the information there embedded in them. If you don't mind sending us your PowerPoints, what we'll do then is we'll find a way to put that information in printed form up on the web for people who would like to consult it. So thank you again, all of our panelists. So Patrick Gray, Becky Klatzkin, Beatrix Weil. Thanks to Matt Darian, our Chief Communications Officer, who has been brilliant behind the scenes through all of this series. And we thank you, especially our audience, for coming and for trusting us with your time. And we look forward to seeing you in the future, electronically or with good luck and God's grace in person on campus. From Memphis, thank you very much and good night.